Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the London Policing College to our event, which is to discuss violence against women and girls. My name is Parm Sandhu. I've got 30 years of experience working in policing, and I retired as a Chief Superintendent from the Metropolitan Police in London. I have worked within the honour-based abuse environment, domestic violence, and also the FGM, which is female genital mutilation areas, and it is something that I care passionately about. I've got an absolutely amazing audience with me today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Yasmin, would you go first?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yasmin Khan, and I'm the director and founder of the Halo Project charity, which is a charity based in the northeast of England and which provides national coverage for victims who've experienced honour-based abuse, forced marriage and FGM. I'm also one of the authors of the Police Super Complaint, which I'll talk about later, which looks at features which examine disproportionality in policing, which can harm individuals and are of public interest. I've also been a member of the independent panel for the London Fire Brigade, which looked at misogyny and discrimination.
Thank you very much. Gary, can we get you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Detective Superintendent Gary Miles, and I'm the head of the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, which is based within the City of London Police. I'm responsible for the receipt, assessment and actioning of all allegations of fraud and cybercrime that are reported through the much maligned Action Fraud Service. I have over 38 years of policing experience and I'm considered to be an expert in the prevention and detection of fraud and cybercrime. It seems strange to have a fraud and cybercrime expert on a violence against women and girls panel. However, we're now starting to identify that the online space is somewhere that's being exploited quite a lot, particularly targeting women and girls.
Thank you. Leigh, can I get you to introduce yourself?
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Leigh Beek. I'm recently retired from the Metropolitan Police after just shy of 30 years service. When I retired, I was on secondment to the National Crime Agency and in the role of Detective Chief Inspector in the Joint International Crime Centre, which was, as I say, based in Vauxhall for the National Crime Agency. And we basically supported UK policing, 43 police forces, with advice and guidance on how to deal with intelligence and information requests across the globe. In my 30 years, I was very passionate about being victim focused, and very early on in my service, I was a SOE officer and a family liaison officer and worked in child protection across 3 different boroughs. I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. The aim of today's workshop is to discuss the role of leaders and leadership balancing excellence at policing with criticism to make changes, and also the higher level capability that's needed in the complex situations. We will be touching on the cyber security for women and girls to reduce opportunities for coercion and enhance reporting and safety. And can I just remind everybody, we have got an audience here in the room of about 30 people. Can I just remind everybody to switch their phones off so that it doesn't disturb the panel? I'm going to start with the question to Yasmin first. Now, Yasmin, you mentioned super complaint, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people who won't know what that actually means. So could you just tell us a little bit about the super complaint and what led you to make that super complaint?
Sure. The super complaint process was introduced in 2018, and it was a joint initiative between the Home Office, the Independent Office for Police Complaints, the Inspectorate of Policing, and the College of Policing. And it was really an invitation for organisations, predominantly from the non-NGO sector, to come forward and put forward a range of investigation on where they felt there was particular disproportionality. And it was an open process. We applied as one of the bodies. There were only 16 that were successful to receive the designated body to look at a police super complaint, and we were one of only 2 Black minoritized organisations that were successful in the process. The other organisation was Southall Black Sisters, and they conducted a piece of research which led to changes in the firewall for policing for women with uncertain immigration status. We wanted to ensure, because of the practice that we had undertaken, huge discrepancies for victims within Black and minoritized ethnic communities who had experienced sexual abuse. We felt we had considerable evidence that highlighted disproportionality in police investigations, and the purpose of the police super complaint is really to focus on England and Wales police forces. So not to look at your region or your area of policing, but actually to start looking at features across England and Wales which would disproportionately impact victims within the BME community. And we had compelling evidence to highlight the particular failings, but you have to be quite focused with a police super complaint. So we focused down on 9 particular features which we highlighted in the police super complaint. We worked with many specialist organisations like ourselves across England and Wales. So having an understanding of a trauma-informed approach to identify what those failings were very, very important. So it's really important to work with organisations like us who've been established to represent a particular community group, which we felt really featured quite disproportionately in terms of level of service. So we conducted almost a 3-year piece of work looking at academic research. We looked at case information from our sister organisation across England and Wales, and it was very much survivor-led. And we focused in on 9 particular features. The first feature we felt, and we provided evidence to the inspectorate, was the overuse of voluntary suspect interviews. So for example, if there was a crime alleged, an allegation of sexual assault, there was a reliance on police officers to offer voluntary suspect interviews. They didn't enforce the interview to take place, even though there was some serious allegations of sexual abuse where children were in the properties. It was more a case of a softer approach for those communities from Black minoritized communities. So that was the feature 1. The second feature, which is really important, was the failure to consider honour-based abuse. And this impacted disproportionately on victims that we interviewed and that we completely knew about. They didn't recognise the impact of honour-based abuse on the abuse. So they really didn't look at the risk of the multiple perpetrators, the perpetrators that were in some ways connected to the family. They treated it like a normal, and not that anything is normal at all around sexual abuse, but they didn't really consider anything that would have had impact negatively for those communities. That was the second failing. Keeping victims informed, making sure that they understood from a trauma perspective what was distinct and that would impact differentially for BME victims. They didn't include things like special or protective measures, or keep them engaged, or give them information, in fact, on the court process and what that would entail. For many victims, once they've disclosed sexual abuse, which has honour-based abuse attached to that, it's a very high risk. It should always be considered as high risk. I spoke to some of my colleagues in the Met Police, and in one instance they reported that somebody had contacted them to report honour-based abuse, and within 72 hours they were brutally murdered by the hands of their families. So the escalation of risk is immediate, and I think the police response needs to accommodate the seriousness and the risk around honour-based abuse. There was a differential impact around community impact assessments that were taken for victims who'd experienced forced marriage or honour-based abuse, and there was a re-traumatising of the process for them. So there was considerable failings. The report was upheld, and subsequently there was a series of recommendations that were issued by the inspectorate in December of last year, with a 56 days notice for police forces in England and Wales, and some attention for the Criminal Justice Service, as well as police and crime commissioners, about how much more they need to engage with victims within the BME communities. And I think it's fair to say that prioritising BME women in policing across England and Wales, there's a huge need to look at the disproportionality, not just because it's a social justice issue, because it's a critical policing priority, and I think that is overlooked. What I do hope is that this police super complaint will really highlight those disproportionality, but there is so much more work that needs to be done, and I think that for me is something that's really important in ensuring there's accountability and there's leadership, in ensuring that no communities are disproportionately impacted by investigations.
You've made some really good points there, and that's the disproportionality due to possibly language, cultural, other issues faced by BME communities. But in addition to that, we have also got the online activity. So I'm going to go to Gary just to talk a little bit about the violence against women and girls within the online community, because we are talking about different communities that are affected in different ways, and the super complaint came out of that difference. So can you just tell us a little bit about the online activity in relation to violence against women and girls?
So the Office for National Statistics currently says that fraud and cybercrime is 3.7 million offences per year, and that's 40% of the total offending. Why I mention that is because 89% of that offending is cyber enabled, or it's enabled by technology. However, the technology hasn't just made it easier to commit fraud and cybercrime. It's made it easier to commit a number of other offences because of the anonymity and the difficulties around identifying suspects. But the key areas that you'd look at are what we're seeing is social media hacking, and hacking for extortion purposes is probably the largest volume type offence at the moment. You're then looking at various different things like impersonation, stalking, harassment, grooming for sexual purposes, domestic abuse, cyber flashing, revenge porn. All of those are being reported in the online space. And when we start looking at the reports that are coming through, women are 27 times more likely to be harassed online than they are in the physical world. 27 more times to be harassed than men are. 1 in 7 young women have experienced threats to have their intimate images or videos released to the online space. 85% of women who experienced online domestic abuse from a partner or ex-partner says it's just a continuation of the pattern of the abuse that they've been experiencing in the physical space. There's some young people here today. 23% of girls 11 to 16 and 33% of young women between 17 and 21 have been harassed online. And yet, of the 3.7 million offences that we're seeing recorded by the ONS at the moment, we're only seeing 500,000 of those reported to police. So in actually starting to get some trust and confidence with people to actually report them to the police so that we can start actioning them and start investigating them in a correct manner and delivering some form of outcome or support for those that are being victims of it. The largest targeted demographic for cyber dependent offences is females between the ages of 20 to 29, and they will be targeted for social media hacking. And either their social media account will be taken over, or there will be spyware placed on their system. Now, whether that's for domestic abuse or for other purposes, but equally, 50 to 59-year-old women are also targeted for hacking and hacking of personal devices rather than social media devices. So what we've recognised is that the online space is becoming as dangerous, and what we're now trying to do is provide people with advice and guidance in how they can recognise it themselves and how they can stop and block it themselves. But equally, if also the importance of reporting it for us so that we can give a correct intelligence picture, look at what a strategic assessment, and then deliver the right support in relation to it. The other thing I would say is, coming on to what Yasmin's saying, is it's that capability piece. Every police officer will be trained from a very, very early age on how to investigate burglaries and robberies and car thefts. But their capability in relation to investigating fraud and online offences is probably not as high, and it's not become as business as usual, in spite of the fact that that will be the volume type of offending that is experienced.
I'm going to come back to both of those subject areas because they are so in-depth and there's so much there to unravel. But first of all, I'm just going to go over to Leigh because you've both talked about training and about what can be done. So Leigh, can you just tell us a little bit about Sarah's law and what that is and how that deals with some of the issues that we've talked about very, very briefly at the moment in relation to training and what can be done to protect women and girls?
Yeah, women and girls. So, so Sarah's law is, and there's Sarah's law and there's Claire's law. Sarah's law is in relation to child sex offender disclosure scheme, and Claire's law is in relation to domestic violence disclosure scheme. They're not actually laws. So that can be complicated when we send a message overseas to ask for information. But what we need to remember is that in relation to offenders, although from an international perspective, it's not just about whether an offender has resided overseas. It can be about whether a person's travelled overseas. As we know, a lot of domestic violence occurs when people go on holiday. So it's important that we broaden our horizon in relation to where we want to gather that information. Now, these schemes are around right to know and need to know. So in relation to domestic violence, you might have the domestic violence disclosure scheme. You might have, say, for example, a victim, potential victim that's living with a person who they're concerned about or may have heard that they've got a history of violence. They're not particularly wanting to make an allegation at this stage, but they just want to know whether they're safe. Equally, you might have parents of a young lady who, or male, who's concerned that they're living with somebody who's potentially violent. So in that respect, if we just talk about the domestic violence disclosure scheme, although a parent might ask police if this person is known, the information would then be given by police to the potential victim. So it's about safeguarding that victim, and it's not to say that if we went overseas to ask that, if that person is known, we would then divulge all of that information. There's procedures that police have to go to and go through when they decide whether or not they're going to disclose that information to victims or potential victims. So it's very similar with Sarah's law, and so grandparents or anybody who is concerned can ask if the person that they believe may be cause or have access to that child may be a threat to that child. They can ask the police if this person is known criminally, and also we can go overseas to ask that via Interpol. Interpol is one of the ways we can ask that on an Interpol inquiry form, and that is what the Joint International Parm Sandhu would do. They would assist you in that inquiry. What's the best route of that inquiry? We also have a large delegation of foreign officers based in London. We've got 42 countries that are represented in London by 163 members, and we can go to those to ask them whether or not we're likely to get that information overseas. We can send an Interpol form. It can be done urgently if necessary, but it's really important that when you are dealing with an investigation, that you don't just think about that person's offending history here in the UK. We have to broaden our horizon because of migration and because of people going away. There can be some really valuable information overseas that can assist you in safeguarding victims over here. And it can also be used, with CPS. We can give that information to CPS that can look at bad character evidence as well in relation to somebody offending overseas. And there's other mechanisms like APRO that are generally done automatically. But I think with Sarah's law and Claire's law, I don't think police are looking overseas as often as we should be. So it's not really being utilised nearly as much as it should be.
And can I just clarify, Sarah's law and Claire's law, what are they based on?
So they were
Who were they?
Oh, so Sarah Payne was a child whose parents had been befriended by a man, Roy Whiting. They weren't aware that he was a sex offender, and unfortunately, Sarah was murdered by him, and her mother, Sarah, then campaigned for many years that if there is a child sex offender, that obviously they go on the sex offenders register, and that families can find out that we can find out if a child is at risk, and we can be told if the person is a child sex offender. And Claire's Law was a campaign by her parents or her father, of Claire Wood, who had met a male on, I think it was a social media website. She had a relationship with him. She tried to end that relationship, but she was completely unaware that it had a really violent background. Had she been made aware of that, then safeguarding would have been put around Claire. I think the police did know, they were aware that they didn't have there wasn't a way to tell her, because of data protection. And now there is, we have got this, it is that right, that need to know. We can tell them now if they're at risk. And unfortunately, yes, he murdered her, because she would never got into a relationship with him if she'd known that. But and the first sign of realising that he was, she was scared of him. If she'd have gone to the police, then now we would have been able to disclose that information to a safeguard. And it's tragic, but it's good that we now have those schemes. But like I said, I think because they're not routinely discussed and talked about, I don't think it's one of the first things that police would maybe think, well, maybe we can do that, and maybe we do need to give this information over to families and victims to let them know that it's their decision ultimately. But information is power. Once they know, then they can make those decisions without telling them they don't know.
Thank you. So we've just got a brief overview of your backgrounds and the knowledge that you've got in your particular areas. Now, one of the things that comes out for all of them, and especially in the two, Claire's Law and Sarah's Law that you just mentioned, is policies have changed because of tragic incidents. Now, so going back to you, Yasmin, what do you think could change? What training needs to be put in place, or what changes need to happen to actually improve the way that the victims are treated, and the way that the prosecutions are taken further? And then, Gareth, I'm going to ask you the same question in a couple of minutes, because it is all about the learning and the education that happens from these tragedies, and also from the recommendations that are made by the Super Complaint Report. So, Yasmin, can I ask you first?
Yeah, and if I can, I'd like to start off with a statement that a victim reminded me of, that was interviewed as part of the Super Complaint. And she said to me, I'm not asking for favourable treatment, I'm asking for fair treatment. And I think that's a really good position to start from, because if you look at the disproportionality for certain communities and certain groups in our communities, BME women often experience 3 times more serious incidents than their white counterparts. Every incident is tragic, by the way. Of course, we were on that agreement. And BME women are 3 times more likely to die by suicide. So if you frame the conversations around what training, what policies and procedures need to be implemented, I think it's really important to recognise the baseline of where we're starting from. And that's why training is essential. Not only is training essential, but I think the context for change has to be often led by data and intelligence. And there's always going to be disproportionality when you're working with specific groups, and that includes LGBTQ communities, that includes people with disabilities. There are some considerable discrepancies in some of our data systems across the world because of the underreporting that exists with specific groups. So I think if we start from that position of understanding that there are going to be a lack of policies around protecting particular groups. Training is really important, but what's more important than training is the implementation of that training. Very much I have seen, especially when it comes to honour-based abuse, forced marriages and FGM, there is training that's being delivered, but when you have first responders, call handlers, who are the first point of contact for that victim, for that survivor, who cannot explain what honour-based abuse is. I have never spoken to victims, and I have spoken to as part of my role as a national advisor for the Welsh Government on violence against women and domestic abuse and sexual violence. I have never ever had a victim who says, I'm a victim of honour-based abuse, or they're being controlled, or there's coercion, or there's multiple perpetrators. So training is essential, but what is also important is the implementation of that training. Understanding when they go to a particular job where an honour-based abuse incident is critical, that they do not make that situation worse. It's important to understand what those risks are and what those flags are. But for police officers who I've spoken to as a result of the rollout of the super complaint, they want to know what the training is, but they want to know how to handle cases. So operation policing, leadership, procedures, training, it's part of a wider solution around a whole systems approach that must be considered when you're protecting victims in Black and minoritized communities, because your response may actually infuse the situation without making sure that the individual is protected and is safeguarded. Not just them, because if you're working with a family, it's about their siblings. If there's an incident around sexual abuse, historical sexual abuse, there are others in that family that also need to be protected. But the training on honour-based abuse and forced marriage and FGM will not give you that practical methodology on protecting the individuals and those in that family. So we've got to look at training, but we've got to consider the whole system approach, which is much needed to ensure the protection and the safety of women, their families, and those communities that we protect.
Gary, what would you add to that, bearing in mind that your experiences on the online communities, so especially in light of the coercion and control, because that's not physical, that's using cyber crime enabled even.
Well, I'd echo what Yasmin has said, but I'd equally add there it's timing of the training. I believe that from a very, very early age, now within your policing career, you should be comfortable with digital investigations, cyber investigations, fraud investigations, and working on the online space and gathering the evidence from that area. We're all taught about how to take exhibits, and secure and the continuity and integrity of physical exhibits, but it's actually looking at how you do that in the digital arena to make sure that you secure the evidence you need for prosecutions, but also then are able to provide that safeguarding the response. There has to be that understanding with, the difference between a first responder's response to those, because they're the people that are probably going to be who deal with people first, as in the name says, and also then what's required in the specialist training and the specialist response, and ensure that we get that transfer between the two of them when it's appropriate, but as an equal time. Yasmin mentioned intelligence, and Bishard was certainly a seminal moment within policing, and for those of you that don't know, Bishard was a judge that led a review into the murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman by the suspect Ian Huntley. And because police services at that time were not sharing intelligence between police forces, he was able to move from Grimsby down to Cambridgeshire, and without people knowing that there was a lot of information that was stored about him targeting young ladies, young girls, and as such he then got the caretaker's role at the school where Holly Chapman and Jessica Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman lived. So yeah, various policies are changing, and there is a great deal of catching up to do. I know for certain within our new service and our new system that we're making sure that we are fully National Intelligence Fund compliant to be comply with the Bishard review, to make sure that everybody has access to the information. So it's more that the holistic safeguarding response can be. Somebody who is a victim of domestic abuse in the physical world may also be experiencing a similar sort of thing in the online space. And if there's evidence that we can, or information that we can show to support them in that, well, then it's that understanding of how we get access to that and then how we act upon it from that point. And that's the two separate things. It's training in relation to the criminal investigation and then subsequent criminal prevention of the offences that are going forward. But equally then ensuring that we're fully compliant with our safeguarding duty to those people that are suffering these levels of offence. That's got to be done from the first moment people become police officers, and then carry on that professional development throughout their careers.
Thank you. And then, Leigh, can I ask you the same question, but can I get your perspective in relation to SOIT officers? So if you could explain what a SOIT and an FLO is, and how that training would impact on the practitioner's work.
Yeah, so I mean, things have changed, and there's been advances in relation to the SOIT officers and PIDVAs. You know, so you've got your normal independent domestic violence advisor, but then there's also one for sexual offences. But a sexual offences a SOIT officer is somebody who's trained within sexual offences investigation techniques, and that is for obviously dealing with someone who's been a victim of serious sexual assault, and you would chaperone that victim and take them through the procedure, the forensic procedures that then take place, which would normally be nowadays at a haven, if there is one available, and you would be with that victim whilst they went through that initial examination, and then take their statement from them and support them throughout the court procedure. Statements can take a very, very long time, and so you build a rapport up with the victim, which can, you would be with that victim for quite a considerable amount of time, maybe weeks at a time. Now, family liaison officers generally are brought in for, you normally see them in the press when there's been a murder and the family is supported by a family liaison officer, but that's not their sole role, and they're not, I think people confuse the role of the family liaison officer to be there just for support and, to look after the family. They're not counsellors. They are there as part of the investigation team. Their role is to assist the investigation team and pass information between the say, for example, the officer in the case that's dealing with the if it is a murder or a really serious incident, passing that information, being a conduit for that information between the victim and the victim's family and the investigation team. I mean, there was one case that I dealt with many years ago, and I was the family liaison officer for a lady who'd been really badly assaulted by her partner, but she felt that she had lost all faith and confidence in the police by the way she was dealt with, and she was from a minority background, and I think she reported crimes previously to police, and they hadn't been particularly taken seriously, which then led to her getting serious injuries, and he was going to be arrested for attempted murder. He'd stabbed her several times, and she did have life-threatening injuries, but when she was sufficiently recovered to speak to officers, she wouldn't engage with police at all. Understandably so. She was very angry. So they actually then asked me to come in and be her family liaison officer to rebuild that trust and confidence in policing, and I was able to do that. She was incredibly brave, and by being with her, and I was basically dedicated to her this was when I was on child protection team, so I was able to then be released from my role to be with her for everything she needed, along with the info who would help her with other more practical solutions, moving house and things like that. But working together, I was able to go to meetings with the council to explain that this is why it was so important. Anyway, to cut a long story short, she was able to then go to court. We were able to support her through the court procedure, and he was found guilty and was in prison for life for attempted murder. But I think, obviously that can't happen in every single case, but when we do have cases where victims have lost that trust and confidence in police, it would be ideal, I know, in an ideal world, to have more family liaison officers able to assist in those sort of circumstances. Because when you think, having gone through that, even police officers get very, very nervous going to court and giving evidence. So for a victim to have to turn up at court with the perpetrator there, having survived such horrific injuries, it took huge amounts of bravery. And I think we've talked before, haven't we, when we've said, is it really what the victim wants? Is that really what the victim wants and needs, to go to court and see a prosecution? Or do they need to be removed from that and be safe? We were able to remove her and be safe, and we were very fortunate that that she was so brave and she gave evidence, and he did actually get convicted and go to prison. But it's a real fine line sometimes. But I think it would be very helpful if we were able to support some the victims just that little bit more, especially when we think, oh well, we're going to go for a victimless prosecution. But I appreciate that that's in an ideal world, but hopefully one day we'll reach that.
Some really interesting points there from all of you, and we do have to balance. When you've worked in policing, you do have to balance what's the most important thing. Is it getting a prosecution, or is it getting that victim or the survivor to a place of safety? And that's the very difficult balancing act. And even when victims do come forward, they themselves have to make a choice, because sometimes the person that is going to be arrested and possibly sent to prison or incarcerated is the main breadwinner. Financially, they could be dependent on them. They've got children, so it could be the father of their children. So there's all those issues there. But in addition, we have got issues around trust and confidence in policing now. And when that victim comes forward, they're balancing their financial issues, the place of safety issues, the trust and confidence, possible language, cultural issues, and IT-based, cyber-enabled crimes that have been committed against them. So going back to the trust and confidence side of it, Yasmin, what do you think we can do to encourage victims to come forward? Because this isn't just a policing problem. You're an NGO and you're a very successful charity, and this shows how you work with the police to protect and put those victims, those survivors, into a place where they are safe, and the prosecution may not be the most important thing in your world. So how do you think that we go about doing that?
I think it's fair to say that reporting crimes to the police, specifically around domestic and sexual violence, with a Wayward Cousins case, with a number of cases that have been raised in the media recently, it's probably the worst time if you're a woman and you're reporting a crime. It is complete lack of trust. The communication seems to have completely broken down, and that's why police forces are really prioritising violence against women and girls, and I think that's right to do. In Wales, we have a policing task force made up of the 4 police services, and they are doing some great work to really work with those communities, really tackle the violence against women and girls agenda, which actually, if you look at the priorities in policing, is really right up there, and so it should be. But there is so much work to be done around increasing that public confidence. The whole point of the super complaint was to really identify a features of policing, which really harmed the public interest. And I think it's fair to say all the police super complaints that were forwarded and have been successful all highlighted huge issues around trust. How do the police in this society rebuild the trust of the communities? It's about going back to basics and really accepting the wrongs that have been done, because you cannot start and move forward without recognising that there is so much work to be done in this space. So much work to be done in this space for all communities, particularly where there's been failings around sexual abuse. We've looked at the rape review, which looks at less than 3% of prosecutions that are going to be taken to a criminal outcome. And I think the recognition that all communities are different. You're absolutely right, Parm. For Black and minoritized communities who I speak to, who I support on a daily basis, for them, a successful prosecution is not the best outcome for them. So I think we need to have an understanding that we do not and we should not be promoting a one-size-fits-all approach. But there is so much work that needs to be done in terms of, rebuilding that trust, engaging with local communities. And it's that notion of, if we don't see you, I can't be you. If you look at policing and the workforce, there are huge issues around diversity profiling, and communities do not feel safe. There are so many instances, or there seems to be a reporting of institutional racism, and that's something that has to be accepted. That does exist. So it's about leadership, It's about promoting, that one size does not fit all, that there are communities that will need specific attention to work with them and to ensure that their views are represented. And I think taking on the model of the Crown Prosecution Service, the race and scrutiny panels, I think it's important for police officers and police services to look at violence against women and girls and making sure that it becomes an independent element of policing, and an element of policing that is flexible and fluid to engage with and truly represent the needs and the barriers that particular communities face. Only then can we say that, we are looking to reform, and I think reform is an important word to use in terms of policing reform. There needs to be a transformation of policing that we haven't seen to date since the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, and we know where that led to some changes, but there is so much more to do in that space.
Gary, what would you add in relation to improving trust and confidence to get victims to come forward? Because you earlier you mentioned that there's a section of the community, younger women and girls, who are targeted through this sort of cyber-enabled coercion and control. And then you mentioned the older age groups as well, and they may not be as capable on the IT systems. They may not be able to defend themselves or protect themselves. So what would you recommend?
Well, particularly what we see through the fraud offending, both the physical and in the online space, and the cyber offending for women are more inclined to report crimes, is what we see in the space. However, also women are a lot more likely to feel guilt and embarrassment about the type of offending that they are being targeted for, and therefore a lot, particularly in the older generations and age groups, won't do it. The younger generations, things like revenge porn and things like that, they don't want to report it. They don't want it to be known, wider amongst
do you think people know that they can report revenge porn?
I don't at the moment. I do. Revenge porn came in. I'm going to test my knowledge here now. 2015, I think. The Courts Act, I think it was in Criminal Justice and Courts Act in 2015, and it's something that I don't think is used enough, because I don't think people are aware that of the specifics in relation to that particular offence. And from my memory, it's if somebody who posts something online with the deliberate intention of causing distress to another. Now that used to be investigated under malicious communications previously, which was a summary-only offence. Liability was for maximum, I think, 6 months imprisonment, whereas revenge porn has a 2-year sentence attached to it. So I don't think people are aware of the various different legislative opportunities that there are involved in policing. But equally, I would say is not all of these people want a prosecution response. If you were to take social media hacking, describing it at the moment, most of them, because the social media companies now will look at what's being done, will deactivate their accounts, and as a result of deactivating their accounts, they will lose their photographs, the things they've done previously, and a lot of personal information. So a lot of them just want to report it so they can reactivate their accounts and get all of that stuff back. Don't want to support that prosecution going forward. And equally, and I understand the CPS and the rape scrutiny panel, I think this needs a full system response. And I'm not saying that policing doesn't need to reform. It does need to reform. It needs to accept some of the problems that have happened in the recent past and for longer. However, it's not just limited to policing. It does need for example, as a police officer, I don't make the decision if somebody goes to court or not. That's a CPS decision. And if I can't get somebody to court, then I can't secure a conviction in relation to that. So actually, we need to be looking at wider across the criminal justice sphere, as it were, to make sure that there's reform across that to cover all of these aspects.
Do you feel that police legislation and ways of prosecuting has kept up with the IT technology and the AI, or are we way behind?
Well, IT technology, and the one thing that keeps me awake at night is AI at the moment, because we don't know what's going to happen in relation to that. It's an emerging trend as to where we're going forward at the moment. No, it hasn't. It hasn't kept up with the other thing. We talk about cyber crimes, the Prosecutions of the Computer Misuse Act, which was written in the 2000s. 2006 was the Fraud Act, and that was actually modernising it from the 68 Theft Act. You've got the Online Safety Bill that is starting now to come forward and make it, I think that goes through Parliament this year and is due to go into enactment next year, which will make the responsibility of social media companies and other platforms to remove advertising, identify false personas and things along those lines. So no, we are still playing catch up, both in an investigative term, but also a legislative term as well.
Okay. So I'm going to come to you, Leigh. So when we're talking about newer and maybe less well-known advances in international tools, can you tell us a little bit about what is happening in that online activity?
Well, in relation to other international tools that I think are probably quite underused is in relation to the Parm biometric exchange. Parm is a place in Germany, and that's where the agreement was made several years ago now, that we would share DNA biometrics with our European counterparts, some of them, and every few months we get another member of European countries that join us. I think we've got something like 22 countries that we're currently connected to for DNA, and 20 countries that we're connected to for fingerprints. And by the end of the financial year, I think the Home Office is hoping that we'll be connected to everybody in Europol. Obviously, internationally, further afield from that, we can use Interpol, but via Europe, we have this constant stream where any DNA that is taken is washed through Parm. What I don't think people understand, and what we're not really using, is that when Parm was agreed, it was in order to identify unknown crime scene stains. So if we had, say, a burglary here, DNA, we've put it through our system here, there's no hit, it will be washed through the other countries that are connected to Parm. And if there is a suspect known, say for example in Germany, they would then tell us who that person is, or they would say there's been a hit. We would then apply to find out who that is, etc. But what I didn't know when I joined the International Crime Coordination Centre was that if we had a suspect here, we knew who that person was, and say for example we arrest him for a rape over here, we get his DNA, we know who he is. That would still be washed through the Parm database. If there was a hit, I'll say Germany again, if there was a hit in Germany, we wouldn't automatically be told, because the whole premise of the Parm was to identify unknown. So the fact that we know who he is, we wouldn't necessarily be told that he had a hit in Germany. So what officers should be doing when they have a known suspect in some of their cases, especially like precursor offences, potentially like burglary, is ask for a proactive Parm search. So you would ask if there is a hit, and if there is a hit, can we find that out? The Joint International Crime Centre do that to the Parm desk, and they have different desks that do that, and would send that proactive check. It's really, really important. There was one such case where a gentleman was arrested over here for just make sure I get the right one, but he was arrested for a rape over here, but he'd said that he was only 18, so 17 or 18, so he was going to get bailed from court. Now, by doing the proactive search, we found out via fingerprints, via Germany, that actually he had claimed asylum over there when he was 21. So that information, finding out that he was 21 years old, was able to keep him on remand and not release him out to the community. And another example was in where it can be used as bad character evidence to assist you with CPS if they're struggling to make a decision, is there was a particular case where a male had met a female online. They went out for a date. She felt unwell later on, woke up the next day, said that she thought she'd been raped. It came down to consensual. He said it was consensual. You know, and if you've got one word against the other, as we know, it's very difficult to prove. And on this particular occasion, we sent a proactive check and found an identical allegation in, I think it was the Netherlands, but it was in one of the Parm countries. So by then going back with that information to the CPS, you know, it's a huge coincidence, or he's incredibly unlucky that every time he goes out and meets someone, this sort of thing happens. So that was enough to give to the CPS to give them that intelligence that they could then look at charging him with the rape. So it's a really valuable tool. Sorry.
But do you think that enough police officers know about the Parm process?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I'd worked in, when I worked before, I joined the International Crime Coordination Centre, I worked at the Sensitive Intel Unit on the International Liaison Team. I knew Parm was there, I didn't really understand what it was. I didn't realise that, I would say to people, oh yeah, do a Parm check, you'll get told if he's known overseas. And of course you're not, unless you ask. So I didn't know that, and I thought I knew most things, you know, so it was a big shock to me. But I don't think officers genuinely know about the intricacies of Parm. I don't think they really understand Interpol or Europol or any of these international tools that we have that can really assist them with their investigations. And Parm, you know, people don't understand where that, you know, officers don't understand where it's from or what it's, the history behind it or how it can assist them with their investigations. It sounds scary when we talk about biometrics. I don't think we use, like I said, we don't use Interpol enough in relation to biometrics. People don't really, and you know enough about that. And unless you're using it all of the time, you're not going to get really familiar with it and use it as you know, with every single investigation. It's a lot of paperwork, but it can come up with some really good results.
Wonderful, thank you. If anybody online has got any questions, if they put them in the chat bar, they are being passed through to me. So I'm just going to go to a couple of questions before we revert back. Leigh, can I stay with you? And the first question is, does Sarah's law go far enough to trigger a response from policing to identify potential offenders, or is it left to the person requesting this information to take action?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question to ask, really, because we should, if policing are aware that a victim is potentially at risk, they do have to tell them. We are now obliged to make sure that victim is aware. I'm not sure if officers probably are fully trained in that area and know that they're obliged to do that. I think, you know, there's complexities around who decides what gets told. But so I'm not sure that policing is fully aware of the obligations that we hold around that. What was the rest of the question?
It was.
And is it left to the person?
Is it left to the individual asking for the information to take action? So once they get the information, who then acts on it, or what is the activity?
Yeah, I mean, we would obviously, we would have to do a risk assessment, wouldn't we? But at the end of the day, you know, when we tell a person that we believe that they're at risk, obviously it is down to them to do what they will with that information. Different if we've got children, if there's children within the house, you know, if we've told them that you know, we believe they're at risk of domestic violence or abuse, or, you know, neglect of their children, if they refuse to safeguard their children, then obviously there's other things that we would have to look at, which could be quite uncomfortable. But it has to, and I think that's what it says, it has to be, everybody has to be on board with this. I think we talked about Crown prosecution. You know, everyone needs to be on board with this. Things need to change. We need to speed up prosecutions, and you know, I think so. The police has got a role, and a very important role, but it's got to be a joint responsibility, not just policing, CPS, social services, healthcare. Everyone needs to come on board, and we need to speed up these investigations. I don't want to hijack it, but I just wanted to say that what Yasmin said earlier about the suicide rate as well. There seems to be an awful lot of work happening in the space where victims' families are getting the laws changed, like Sarah's law, Claire's law, Jade's law, which has just changed in relation to parental responsibility. But I know that we're now looking at in relation to victims of suicide who take their lives because of the persistent malicious communications and that pushing them towards that. I know that they're looking at that, looking at those prosecutions, or looking at now having a post after somebody's died prosecution. But again, I don't know if this is something that's out there and that people are aware of that. You know, police are aware of that. We need to increase in all areas. There's so much more to do.
No, that's really helpful.
That does come back to, you know, talking to some of those. For the last 10 years, there's been a national shortage of detectives within policing, and it's taken a long time to regrow that detective experience, because investigating crime as a detective is a specialism in itself. And then you can have, whether it be murder, sexual offences, fraud, you can have specialisms within the detective sphere. And it's really, really important when we're starting to get people through as detectives, whether they're direct entry or whether they come through the normal policing route, to actually know about these things. I did my detective cert 5 years ago, and I was sent away on a 15-week training course to do it. I'm not sure whether now, because of cost and things like that, we spend that amount of time training our people.
I agree, because it's worth investing in people who know what they're looking for and how best to serve the public. So absolutely agree with you, and I think that was really helpful. I'm just going to go back, Yasmin, to yourself. There's been a few questions in relation, and I'm just going to cover the ones for the online first. So given the outcomes of the super complaint and potential correlation with online abuse, is there a clear approach from policing to link the two, given the lack of training and understanding of HBA within the police? Again, it goes back to training, doesn't it?
It does, and I think there's a real a notion to understand, you know, intelligence-led policing is really important, and I think what's lacking in police investigations is that joining up the dots, the lack of multi-agency work, you know, because of the information sharing protocols from one safeguarding authority to another, there's a huge disjoint of that information. So actually the links to serious and organised crimes affecting particular groups such as the Black or minoritized communities is something that should be a policing priority. I'm not saying that all crimes associated are going to be linked to serious and organised crimes. What I'm saying is there is something to consider about joining the dots up around online harm, around serious and organised grooming gangs and exploitation, and it affects all communities. So I think there's certainly something that to be said around that better joined up. And I completely agree with you, Gary, in terms of a victim will not understand, and neither should she or he understand the complexities of our criminal justice system or those around the world. What they need to know is once they've reported a crime, that they are going to be protected, you know, and that's the basic of safeguarding an individual. And I'd also like to consider the public health approach to violence against women and girls. It's really important to understand what the root cause of violence is, for us to fully understand what the protective measures should look at. And I'm a huge advocate, because I see victims being failed regularly around this victim blaming culture. It's the victim's priority. It's their responsibility to report their crimes. We should have a zero tolerance to violence against women and girls, because bystanders at colleges, at universities, in public places, that's a piece of work that the Welsh Government have really taken on board around the bystander approach. You know, this is everybody's business. If we have a safer community, you know, it will, you know, it's £66 billion it costs the economy in England and Wales, domestic abuse. You know, if we get it right from the prevention element, we'll be tackling so many crimes, and we'll be investing in what's really important, which is around preventing abuse in the first place. Really important to consider that in policing priorities and for leaders as well in policing. And
just before we move away from Yasmin, one of the questions is about the multiple perpetrators, how in some cases a domestic violence victim may have more than one perpetrator within the family environment. Could you just elaborate on what that is?
Yeah, in the training that we deliver, domestic abuse is generally a partner, husband, and it's generally one person who's offended against an individual. When we are talking about honour-based abuse, forced marriages, FGM, or domestic and sexual violence within the Black and minoritized communities, there is often more than one perpetrator. Sadly, the perpetrator can either be a sibling, it can be parents, it can actually be a whole community. I remember working in this field about 8 years ago, and we had a very serious case of a victim from a particular community who was protected in the UK because of serious violence that was alleged to her because she made her own choice on her partner. Somebody who was completely disconnected to the family, but originated from the same background, the same village of that individual, a young 19-year-old, was prepared to take on a bounty. So I'm just talking and providing some information about, do not underestimate the lengths that somebody will go to protect and preserve an honour. And when it comes to multiple perpetrators, they're not necessarily, when it comes to honour-based abuse, that's the distinction. It's not just a person who's related. It can be somebody, as we've seen in the Benaz Mahmood tragic killing. It can be the community who is also involved in that collusion, organising the crime, several attempts on her life before they finally took her life. You know, these are people in the community who put themselves forward as bounty hunters, and that's why there has to be a link and a correlation to serious crime around kidnapping and collusion to murder that is often missed in policing investigations, and that's something that should be considered at the very beginning, and that's why that information sharing at multi-agency level is so important. So many of our cases that we've highlighted serious risks for have been downplayed, have been kicked out of Marix because that surely isn't going to happen, and that's what needs to change.
Okay, just before we move on from Yasmin, I've just got one more that's just come in. How can the police and frontline staff ensure more of a collaborative approach to helping frontline staff develop awareness of HBA, forced marriage and FGM?
It really comes down to coordination. You know, they may go, an individual may seek help from one organisation. One of the things that we've really tried hard to do is to replicate the Crown Prosecution Service's Grace and Scrutiny Panel to identify that multi-agency learning for victims experiencing forced marriage and FGM. And there's some great learning to be done across organisations. Sometimes, sadly, what happens, Parm, is we have a safeguarding hot potato. It's not my responsibility, it's your responsibility because you were the first point of contact, and therefore you have that statutory responsibility. I think we've got to have collaboration, coordination, and multi-agency. And again, you know, making sure that victims' voices are heard. A victim said to me recently in the last 6 months, you know, better multi-agency working provides better safety for victims. And if she's saying that, it's something that we should all be considering. We've got to work collaboratively across, share information, have an information sharing agreement to ensure that we have that whole system approach that we really need to embed.
Wonderful. Right, I've got 2 more questions, one for Gareth and one for Leigh, and then I'll ask the audience here if they have got any questions. You can either jot them down on a bit of paper or shout them out. But I'll just cover these 2 first. Right, Gareth, and this is from the online community. You mentioned the 2 separate areas of training needed. The first being training within the criminal investigation space, and then the second being in the criminal prevention space. Are you aware of any plans underway to deliver such training?
Yeah, so within policing terms, what was first arranged was a 4P strategy that was called, and it was looked at: pursue, protect, prevent, prepare. And that is a full system response. So this pursue element talks about the relentless pursuit of offenders and bringing offenders to justice and giving justice to victims by dealing with that. The protect is about engaging with victims, educating victims, raising awareness, promoting behaviour change to A, get them to recognise that it's happening in the first place, but B, also then to secure the system change, get the evidence to secure the system change from it going on in the future. Prevent is the deterring individuals from being involved in this form of criminality. So that's looking at the suspects in relation to it and explaining to the suspects, why they shouldn't be committing this type of crime. And the final bit is prepare, and that's reducing the impact of the offending when it's happening, but equally, reducing the likelihood of repeat victimisation and things along those lines. So yes, I certainly know within the fraud and cybercrime arena, and now we're including that for more offences rather than just the fraud and cybercrime, whether that be violence against women and girls or other offences that sit behind those initial offences, that we are looking at having that full system response. I'm a policeman. One of my major responsibilities is to arrest people and put them to the CPS for a decision to be made as to whether they should be prosecuted or not. And if that decision is made, then I support the CPS in securing that prosecution. But equally, one of the Pelian principles is to prevent crime before it happens. And sometimes, people lose that that understanding. That's one of the things that police officers want to do, as much as they want to go out and arrest and prosecute individuals too.
Thank you, Gary. Leigh, another question that's from the online community, which is, what should women do who are subjected to violence but cannot defend themselves do?
What should they do? That's a difficult one, because I think my initial response would be report it. But obviously we're discussing, aren't we, about people, victims not wanting to do that. They can still go to police and ask if they cannot defend themselves. Well, they still can go. There are still other measures that, without wanting to go down a prosecution, you can still get restraining orders. But, essentially, it's important that these things are reported so that we can then give that protection, to them. And we can't, unless we know, we can't do anything. Like you say, domestic violence prevention orders. There's so many different prevention orders we can now give as well in relation to children. Child sexual harm prevention orders. They don't always have to go down the criminal justice route in order to. You don't have to enter into that criminal justice route in order to get these prevention orders. And when I worked in the community safety unit, we'd have many victims who, would report them, and no, they didn't want to go down, but they still got the support from the IDVA. And I think that's what we do need to look at. I think what's sad very often is if there isn't going to be a prosecution, then the police engagement finishes. That we have to move away from that. But resources are finite, aren't they? We can't, give that support to everyone, but the IDVAs can. And even with when I worked in Merton in the community safety, it was the amount of support we got from Samaritans and things like that, helping victims move. But if anyone's in a violent relationship and they're unable to protect themselves, they can't defend themselves, then that's where we surely have to come in and help them.
And that is where the holistic approach comes in, and that's where the charities come in, the health service, the education. Sorry, Gary, you were going to say
one
something?
Thing I would say the same as Leigh. I want people to report as much as they can so that we can try and help them. But I understand if the trust and confidence, we're still rebuilding that at this point in time. What my advice would be is don't suffer in silence. Just because you don't feel confident in the police doesn't mean there isn't somebody out there that you can speak to, whether that be a charity, whether it be a friend. But the more you keep it inside and to yourself, the more that it can build up and cause problems further on in life. So, if it gets you to that stage then where you do get that confidence by speaking to somebody else to be able to come and report it to police, well then that's great. So if you can't do the first initially, at least speak to somebody.
Yeah, I always have this image in my head of a person, a woman, girl, male even, being beaten up or being in real danger and not picking up that phone. And I always think to myself, pick up the phone, just dial 999. But if you're in a situation where you can't or you don't believe you're going to get the right help, go to your doctor, go to your teacher, go to a social worker, go anywhere. And at the moment, we have got facilities such as in some of the chemists like Superdrug, Boots, some of the banks, where they have got places of safety where if you go in and you say, I'm in danger, I need help, they will make those first referrals and those first contacts for you. So anybody who's ever sitting out there who needs help, you have to ask for help to get the help. And I always have that image of somebody sitting there and suffering in silence, and that's not acceptable in this country or any country. I'm just going to ask the audience here, does anybody have any questions? Because I have got more questions that I need to cover, but anybody? Okay. Oh, sorry. Do you want to shout it out loud and then I will repeat it for the microphone?
Yeah, so the panel aware of any examples where there's been some really good learning from when things go well? So using the positive aspects and innovation within local areas that's been raised up and circulated around to ensure that others learn from that good practice?
That's an excellent question, because we've just been asked if the panel have got any awareness of learning that has come from positive incidents, because we talked about Claire's law, Sarah's law, they all came from tragedies. So there must be some positive stories out there, which is a really good point to make, where there's been learning or legacy. So can I open that up to the panel if anybody's got anything?
I would certainly say we've looked at domestic abuse, stalking and harassment has what's called a DASH risk assessment in relation to it. And it wasn't something that was considered within fraud and cybercrime, and certainly within the Protect network that delivers across policing. But there was a pilot run in the northeast in Newcastle, which correlated a number of, almost 50% of their cybercrime that they were reporting had a domestic abuse connotation to it. So they trained their officers in how to do the DASH risk assessment, which traditional officers would do. And as a result, more people were being identified, that domestic abuse element was being identified more, and that support through the multi-agency safeguarding was being delivered. So much so that through a coordination piece that we run at the moment, that's now been cascaded across all 43 forces in the country. And we're starting to see those results. And we're starting to see more of those elements picked out from this type of offending to provide that support that's required.
I just had to come in there. I think for me, one of the things that really stands out is where a professional has actually taken ownership of a particular issue and worked with the services and ensured that they've kept the victim up to date with what was happening. Even if there was nothing happening, the victim then becomes engaged much more for longer on a particular thing. But I think if you look at a domestic homicide review panel, every single learning and even serious case reviews that we've been involved in, the biggest thing is around training. What could we learn from this incident? How can we make sure that change is happening in our procedures, in our policies, in our training? And it's always back to training. So I think the cases that have worked really well, which have got the best outcomes for the victims, who I have to say the expectations are extremely low considering all the challenges that police forces have, is where the police officers or the first responders, where that one chance is the only chance that the individual is going to get. That's when it's worked particularly well in the one chance rule. In the forced marriage unit, when they did the introduction of forced marriage criminalisation, they gave practice guidelines to a range of health professionals, social and adult children's social services. And the key thing is when you have that one chance only and you take ownership, you work with agencies and you advocate on behalf of the victim, that's where I can possibly cite really good innovation, where things have really worked out well for the victim, because we've believed, we've taken control and we've worked collaboratively in partnership. Those tend to be the cases that have worked effectively.
Yes.
I asked a question because in my previous role as chair of safeguarding adult boards, I learned that safeguarding adult reviews can be done when things go well. We never do it. So, when you're doing things that go well, it's preventing harm, it's preventing homicide, it's preventing these things. So, things obviously, so let's identify that through encouraging more reviews when things go well, and then spread that learning to people with encouragement and congratulations to people who did it. I think actually that positive side may reap some rewards.
So that follow-up there was just to add to the question, which was that there are reviews after safeguarding boards that are positive, where positive outcomes have been found, and how to share those positive outcomes. So that is built into the learning and the development. That's more or less what you're saying? Yeah. Just going to quickly cover, if we don't get through your questions today, because we have got quite a few questions coming in now, please do send them in anyway, and we will be writing a piece for Policing Insight afterwards, and then we'll try and cover the questions that we haven't been able to respond to today in our writing pieces. So please do carry on sending in the questions, but we will cover as many as we can today.
Okay, just before we go into the next question, Yasmin a while ago mentioned something about being data-driven and information-led. One of the key things that I think this is the opportunity to deal with now is whilst we've got to be data-driven, it's got to be the ethical, legal, and appropriate, and realising that actually having data scientists and data ethics analysts to make sure that we are collecting the right information, the appropriate information that we collect. One of the key arguments in relation to facial recognition at the moment is, whether it's being used correctly for a policing purpose, and the police are very, very much in it, then also that collateral intrusion that can go on members of the public and communities that were being involved in the policing arena. So it's another key area that we need to start thinking about how policing and law enforcement use data better, but equally make sure that we're doing it ethically.
And then just adding on to what you've just said there, do you know of any activity in the online space in relation to the violence against women and girls theme? So in your day job?
In data ethics terms,
yeah.
Yes, we're actually trying to build a data ethics and data science department as part of our response in order to be able to tease these things out and look at these things, because I'm not an expert at data. Yes, I can do intelligence analysis and I've been trained in that, but actually data is this whole specific new thing. I know the Met has created a whole data scientist team to make sure that the right data is being looked at and the right conclusions are coming from it. And that's across the policing sphere, not just in counter-terrorism, but in violence against women and girls and things along those lines as well.
Because I know that in the past we have had issues with the data that's been collected either doesn't show gender, ethnicity, age. So we have victims that have very little information on the sheets to say who they are, what they are, where they come from. And so is that being addressed?
That's a data quality issue, and whilst I'm not an expert in that, but ensuring that you get the right quality of data to be able to draw the conclusions that you can. And that's one of the key areas to look at, make sure that we've got we're asking the right questions so that we've got that data to be able to put forward, work through, analyse, and then draw the logical conclusions.
Okay, was there anybody else wanted to add there?
No.
Okay, this next question, I'm not sure we can answer this as a panel, but I'll ask it anyway, and this may be answered later. So, does HBA FGM form part of the DC's course? And if not, why not? So I don't know, unless Richard? No, that's not one that we can answer here, but we will put that one forward.
I mean, the only thing I would say on that is there's quite a lot of information on the police intranet in relation to Project Azure, which is in relation to FGM. So there is information on there. I would be surprised if it's not on the course, but I don't know the answer.
I would be surprised there wasn't a module on it. Is it long enough? I don't know. It would be answers.
And would you just be able to elaborate what Project Azure is for those who don't know?
So Project Azure is in relation to awareness, raising awareness in relation to female genital mutilation. In actual fact, there's been some progress in relation to that in the last couple of days, in that we have, as part of my role when I was in the JIC, was to raise awareness across our European counterparts at Europol. At Europol, so they deal with serious and organised crime, but we wanted to, spread that message across about and get information to see if we're picking up any similarities, or are our counterparts aware of what's going on. There's several, there'll be festivals every year where some of our young girls will be getting taken to, and are our counterparts aware when they go in there that's what's happening. So we've done a lot of work, and one of my ex-colleagues has done a considerable amount of work to get that profile raised at Europol, and it's now on the Europol mandate. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what information we are sharing with them and spreading that awareness across the globe eventually. So that was a real good, that was a real positive step for us, and it does come out of some knowledge that we've got, but not necessarily an individual tragedy, which we were talking about just now, isn't it? That sometimes there is only change after a really serious incident. Of course, there have been victims, but this was just a piece of work that we're really passionate about in relation to raising awareness and sharing that intelligence. And we had a lot of buy-in from our European countries who are really interested in that space, because it isn't something that they're completely aware of.
Okay, thank you. Well, question, I think this one is going to be for you, Yasmin. Right, do you think the current civil remedies and the legislative framework associated with HBA and BORG are adequate at taking into consideration the victim's perspective and wishes, rather than a focus on criminalisation of the perpetrators? So I'm going to start with you, Yasmin, but I am going to go on to the others with that, because that does go right across the spectrum. So is it adequate? Is it enough legislative framework associated with honour-based abuse, violence against women and girls? Is it adequate, taking into account the victim's perspective as well as the criminalisation of the perpetrators?
I hope I can give an example here of the introduction of the forced marriage legislation, which came into effect in 2014. I don't know if anybody knows, but there's literally been a handful of forced marriage prosecutions. If you look at the FGM prosecutions, there have been absolutely, I think, 2 maximum. So I think that kind of starts to tell a story, doesn't it, about whether we have an effective legal framework. And when I speak to victims and survivors and I hear about the experiences that they have had, or the incidents that they have endured, because they do not want their loved ones to be reported for some of the reasons that you highlighted, Parm, because sometimes they're the breadwinner, sometimes they're the father of the children. But when you're supporting victims within Black and minoritized communities, the added challenges of those families being related to the individuals, fear of repercussion of reporting those crimes to policing. So the legal framework doesn't go as far as it should, because it has a focus on the victim making those disclosures and reporting those crimes and seeing that through the entire criminal justice process. And we're not going to talk about the experience of victims in specific groups of the criminal justice process, because it is not favourable in given the special measures, the protective measures, some of the decisions that judges and the lack of awareness that judges have. We're working with the North East Circuit of Judges and hoping to change some of the equality benchmark, and looking at the National Judiciary College having a focus on honour-based abuse. So I know, because of the victims that we speak to on a regular basis and the case-rich data that we have, that the legal framework does not go far enough, because the offenders and those who perpetrate crimes around forced marriage, FGM and honour-based abuse are not being held to account. Even if you look at things like perpetrator programs, there are no perpetrator programs, not cognitive, not the CBT programs. I'm talking about community education programs. There is nothing out there that looks at the crimes committed around honour-based abuse, forced marriage and FGM. So it's really about listening to survivors. The only thing that has proved quite positive is the civil protection orders, so the forced marriage protection orders, the FGM protection orders, which, if you look at the groups who are most at risk, 16 to 25, 27, that has proven quite successful for young people who have used the forced marriage protection orders and the FGM protection order as a deterrent, and that has certainly worked for younger people, but there is so much more work that needs to be done, and the framework doesn't go far enough.
Yasmin, just before I hand over to Gary, could you just tell us what the protection orders are, just briefly?
So as you would have a domestic violence protection orders and new notices with the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, there is a remedy that can be given to anyone at risk of forced marriage or FGM, where any agency can apply. We can apply as a charity, an individual can apply, and there are courts across England and Wales where you can apply for the forced marriage protection orders, which actually has restrictions within those protection orders around surrendering passports, traveling to foreign countries. As you mentioned, you know, there's a particular period, isn't there, the summer holidays and the Christmas holidays, where those huge parties are being organised. And the increase of the age of marriage has gone up to 18 because of campaigners like us, particularly Carmen Havana and ICPRO, around, you know, increasing that age of marriage, which is really important. So that's protection orders which have worked well for some of the young people that we've been supporting.
Thank you. Gary, did you want to add?
I haven't disagreed with Yasmin at all on this panel, and unfortunately I'm going to disagree with you on this time. I get what that Yasmin's saying. I think the legislation is in existence. I just don't think it's being enforced and used on enough cases. And actually legislation is only as good as the compliance and enforcement that is put behind it. You know, equally FGM, as you said with the stats, you can look at bribery. There's the 2010 Bribery Act. You haven't seen many convictions in relation to bribery that's being put forward. It's the Computer Misuse Act, which is 2000. You know, you don't see many people being charged with that, despite there being all of these crimes around. So I do think, you know, the legislation is in existence, and, you know, more laws. You know, you still need more people to be able to enforce those laws and hold people to account when they break those laws. Yeah, so I do think the legislation framework's in existence. I just don't think the appropriate response is being given to it at this time. And whether that's because people don't know about it, are not trained in it, or aren't doing it, I don't know.
Okay. Leigh, what are your thoughts?
I agree with both points made. I think we do have legislation in place. You know, we've got some great, you know, there's been some great progress in relation to protection orders, but I think it primarily does come down to resources as well, and policing resources, and the time these take, not just in the criminal justice system, but for victims who don't necessarily want to go through the criminal justice system. Things will hold them back in relation to, say, children, and, you know, getting rights, you know, that sort of thing, you know, like children's court, and, you know, fathers will still have access to that. How do they then financially support themselves when it's going to take 6 months to get maintenance from their partners if they do leave them? It's very difficult. We said, you know, very often victims will be a victim of domestic violence about 10 times before they'll call police, and then to finally pick up the phone and make that call and be told that this is going to take however long before this case comes to trial, if it comes to trial, and if he does go to prison, he's still going to, you know, he's still be in contact with. There are things that prison can do to stop the contact, but, you know, it's such a long, drawn-out process. The easiest thing for victims to do is just to take them back, you know. And that's what we need to. Everyone needs to work together. So that isn't the easiest thing to do. Prisons, you know, prison sentences that perpetrators are given need to be substantial enough for them to go through programs, you know, domestic, you know, abuser programs. They're not. There's absolutely no point in sending someone to prison for 6 weeks. They're not going to change. It's not going to do anything. So it's about changing the way we do so much. I think the legislation's there. I just think it's taken far too long. We don't have enough resources.
And I'm just going to add my view to that, because in my view, if the legislation is there and it's not used and it's not convicting people for FGM, it's not convicting people for violence against women and girls, that to me would suggest the legislation is not right, because maybe you have to go to too many extremes to get that conviction. And when you're talking about even if it is used, people are going to prison for 6 weeks, that's not going to change their behaviour, I agree, which would suggest that that legislation isn't impactful enough and there isn't a safe environment for that woman, girl, young man, whoever it is, to actually proceed with that to go to court. Because if the safe environment's not there, they can't support the prosecution, you know, whether it's financial reasons or whether it's fear, whether it's intimidation from the community or from peers. You know, that safe environment doesn't exist, which to me suggests the legislation needs to be changed to create that safe environment for individuals to be able to actually get that prosecution, get to court, be able to stand in court and give evidence against the perpetrator and actually see them locked up for what they've done without suffering financial or pressure from any other sorts. So that's my view on that one. We have got more questions. So I'll just go to the next one. Yasmin, can I start with you? Yasmin, is training given in regards to, so do police, you may not be able to answer this actually, is training given to police officers in relation to victims who do not have recourse to public funds? These cases can be challenging and they don't always get the support they deserve. So this may be women or victims who haven't got recourse to public funds.
I think there's a lot of information now about the particular risks. I mentioned one of the other super complaints that was completed by the South or Black Sisters, which looked at fireball. So police services in England and Wales are becoming more aware of the particular barriers for migrant women and those with no recourse to public funding when reporting crimes. But unfortunately, police forces are, as you probably you know better than I do, it's up to them locally about where they source training from. And generally around domestic abuse, there's a huge push for the domestic abuse matters training, which may mention the victims who have no recourse to public funding, but there's no requirement to have that training for police officers. So the short answer is there's huge inconsistencies in training for police officers around domestic abuse and migrant women. It depends on the communities, it depends on the geography of where police services are placed to see whether they feel it's a priority for them. So there's no consistent approach, and as far as I'm aware, there is no specific training on that. It just is delivered as part of the domestic abuse training.
And Gary, what do you think? Do you think there's enough training in relation to the subject matter and also specifically for women or victims who come forward who haven't got that recourse to public funds?
I think the whole issue needs to be looked at in terms of the College of Policing. In terms, you know, when you look at, there are APPs, we call them, authorised professional practices for things like firearms, for things like sexual offences, for murder investigations, that are from the College of Policing to ensure that consistent training is delivered across the 43 forces in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And potentially that it is probably something that, you know, is needed, because I'm not aware of there being an APP in this area.
No, I think it crosses over into uncomfortable ground in relation to Home Office immigration and what their priorities are, where victims are living, if they're living with rogue landlords, you know, so it can be a really complex area for policing to deal with. I'm not aware of any particular training that they would get for that. If I was dealing in the community safety unit, that would be something that I would, the IDFA probably have a lot more information around.
Okay, so we don't actually know if there is any specific training, because I'm not aware of any, but I am aware of victims who are held to ransom almost, where their passports have been taken off them, and if their immigration status is questionable, that can be then used as part of the coercive controlling behaviour and domestic abuse or violence as well. So I don't think that there is any particular training unless it's locally sourced, as you said, Yasmin.
unless it's, you know, one of the other specialist units that may be doing human trafficking.
Yeah, modern slavery,
Yeah.
modern day slavery or human trafficking may have it as well.
I think the most direct way of answering this, have you ever had any training? Because you've been involved in the public protection type world.
No.
And have you, Gary?
I have in terms of kidnap, yes, as a kidnap SAO and looking at it at that respect, but not in the violence against women and girls.
Because I've worked in those areas and I don't remember ever having training in relation to women who haven't got that recourse to the public funds.
No, I think we would probably be relying on charities.
Yeah. And that's whatever's available locally and what's being negotiated. Okay. I'm only going to be able to ask, I think, two more questions, because we are running out of time. So I'm going to ask, this is for everybody, what should good leadership look like in policing and in the charities that support victims? So what should a good leader be doing to promote their team, and what should they not look like physically, but what should their behaviours be like? Yasmin, can I start with you, because obviously you've got a successful charity. So what is a good leader within your charity and in the partnership approach that you've got with policing?
I think for me, there's two things that really stand out there. First is valuing your workforce. Without your workforce, without your teams, you know, it's very difficult to deliver a high quality service. So it's making sure that you have a staff force that is reflective, that is fully committed to the objectives of the organisation, and we are a victim support agency first and foremost, and I think that's really, really important. We've got to know our communities, and we've got to make sure that we are not just half-heartedly investing in our communities or our service, but we actually know who our communities are. We recognise some of those challenges, and that we can reach out to emerging communities as well, because our communities are changing. We need to understand what the priorities are in our communities and who is having difficulties in accessing our services. And to do that, leaders have to be flexible. They cannot be given, there's no toolkit about, you know, this is the static play and this is how you should operate. Your business has to be evolved. You have to know your communities, and you've got to look after the welfare of the staff. And I think that's one thing that the pandemic has definitely taught us, is we have to be responsive. We have to look at the welfare of our teams, and we have to understand what the priorities are in our communities. And I think if we are in tune with that, and we have meaningful dialogue with your staff and the communities, and understand that you cannot solve all the issues in the communities, but you can work with really good partners who can help you deliver the ambition and the vision, that's really important in understanding that. And you've got to be flexible, and that's got to be evolving. And I think those are the key lessons that we've certainly learned from the pandemic.
Thanks, Yasmin. Gary, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated.
Oh, good.
In that, I'm going to ask you about the balance of leadership and politics.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that one.
So what does a good leader look like, and then how do you balance the politics that go with?
I'm going to say that I agree with everything that Yasmin says. As a good leader within the police, I think within the organisation, I think you need to lead by example, and you need to set standards and expectations. I also think, you know, now we need to be able to immediately challenge inappropriate cultures and languages that are happening. As a leader, you need to be able to provide your staff with both the knowledge, skills and resources to be able to undertake the role that you're asking them to undertake, and not expect them to do things that you haven't given those resources in relation to it. You know, and one of the key things, whether as leading, is having honest conversations even when there are difficult circumstances. You know, leadership can be easy when everything's going right, but actually, you know, good leaders stand up when things are going wrong, because they're able to have those conversations. As against balancing it against political requirements, politics has always been there in policing ever since it's not supposed to be. You know, one of the key roles is that police do what the police do without fear or favour, having independence, and you have to look at that and you have to be strong. As a leader, certainly as a senior investigating officer, which I think Leigh will understand, you have to, investigating is about a search for the truth, and you cannot leave any biases, either personal or professional, come into your investigation, and you have to follow where the evidence takes you whilst having your hypothesis in that. So whilst politics is there, you cannot let it affect how you do your job, or then subsequently how your staff do the job that you're asking them to do.
But just going back a step, where Yasmin was talking about the charity and about how they work together, if politically the priority is not violence against women and girls, is there not a juggling act there?
Yes, but throughout my career, fraud hasn't been a priority for 15, 20 years until a problem happens, and then it becomes a priority. But equally, one of the things that you learn is if everything's a priority, then nothing is a priority. So it is a juggling act, and it is, particularly with resources, making sure you have the right resources trained, that are there and able to deal with it, whether it be on a volume level or a specialist level. I still think a lot comes back to training the frontline staff to be able to deal with the volume levels of crime that's being experienced without actually having to have a specialist resource to do it. Things like honour-based violence, female genital mutilation should have that basic response in order to be able to deliver that confidence at the scene, but equally does require a specialist knowledge, a specialist approach. So things along those lines. But generally, the SOE is not the first person that they're talking to. It would be a frontline police officer that they're talking to.
Okay. Leigh, what does a good leader look like to you?
Well, for me personally, I think the most important thing for a good leader is to inspire their staff and care. You've got to care passionately about the work that you're asking them to do, and the reason why you're asking them to do that. And in order to make them, for them to be inspired by your passion and buy into what you're saying, you also then have to support them and make sure they've got enough staff. So this comes along with training, doesn't it? We train the right people to be in the right places, in the right roles. I know that with some of the detective, programs, people might be really good at a particular role, and they're moved from that role because they have to go into this particular role as part of their program. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think if you've got somebody who's really very good at their job, then where we've had in the past tenure where people get moved, I don't agree with that. And I think that a leader who can flex and say that's not right in this situation, and I'm gonna change that, is what's important. I think it's really important that we, like Yasmin said, we listen to our communities. What's important in those communities? Are we focusing our police resources on what's important in those communities? In some communities, antisocial behaviour is a real problem, but we're not focusing on that because for some reason policing think the problem lies elsewhere. And that's how we're letting our communities down. And I think so that is for a leader is listening to what other people's viewpoints are and not being afraid to say, do you know what, I was wrong. I think that's really important. And listening to our staff, empowering our staff. A leader leads their staff, they don't manage them, they listen to their staff, and their staff in return are inspired by them and will follow them. They'll follow a good leader.
And do you think that politics has a part to play?
Massively. Yeah, I think it does. We shouldn't be in, it should have nothing to do with policing. We police by consent. We police by what the communities tell us, and it is the problem. We have to have legitimacy in policing, otherwise they won't listen to us anymore. Why would they listen to us if we don't listen to communities who tell us all the time they don't trust politics? So why has politics got anything to do with policing?
Okay. Right, I'm just going to go back around the panel just for a recap for the bits that you wish you'd said that you didn't have time to say. Is there anything that you wish to add to the conversation? So Yasmin, could I start with you first, please?
Yeah, I think the issue around violence against women and girls seems like a policing issue, and I just wanted to mention that it's not a policing issue, it's a societal issue. And you probably have heard the saying, you know, domestic abuse should be everybody's business, and I think that's a really good place to start. I think violence against women and girls cuts across every single community. There shouldn't be one community that receives extra attention. What we have to be alive to is specific communities are being disproportionately affected. There are communities that are not getting a fair chance when they're reporting a crime, and the systems don't encourage a fair play, in that there are systems, there are policies, and there are institutions that do discriminate. So I think it's really important to recognise there's some formidable work going on with policing agencies. There is so much more work that needs to be done, and it's not an issue that will be resolved by one single agency. This is about ensuring that collaboration and cooperation is achieved. That's the only way that we're going to tackle this issue, which affects every single community. The World Health Organization has, within the pandemic, placed violence against women and girls as one of the major priorities for our society to ensure that we give enough attention to. And there aren't enough resources in our budgets to give one organisation like the police the responsibility. It is everybody's responsibility, but please be mindful that there are communities, and it's been highlighted in the super complaints, that are disproportionately impacted. It's making sure that everybody can safely report and live in an environment where it's free from harm, and is achievable if we work together.
Okay, thank you. Gary?
Yep, I would just go to, I've said some scary stuff about the online space. The online space is a good space. It is, and the accessibility and functionality is a really good area with what the technology explosion has come from. What I would ask people is to, and these are very strong, have strong passwords. Don't just look at me and nod at me and go, yep, yeah, I can see why it's important to have a strong password. Actually take it. Whilst it may take you a little bit longer to access your device, actually you are going to be a lot safer if you have strong passwords in place. Consider two-factor authentication, particularly in relation to your social media accounts. And that way, that can stop potential hacking that can be done. But equally, what I'd say to you is be careful what you reveal about yourself online. It's almost a litmus test of, if you wouldn't do it in the physical space, don't do it online. And applying that test, and that will empower you to be able to, A, stop people getting access to your accounts, but B, then not be exploited and taken advantage of either. And so that's the final message I get there. Enjoy the online space, but protect yourselves whilst you're in.
Gary, just before I move back to Leigh, can you just give us an example of where you've seen something awful happen because of that authentication or of that hacking? That can be shared.
That can be shared. There are so many to mention. Yeah, specific examples. You know, people have given 1.6 million.
Is important as well.
1.6 million. My biggest case was 1.6 million a lady gave away in a romance fraud, so to an individual over 18 months, and she'd never met him. You know, she wasn't stupid. She wasn't greedy. She was just at a particularly vulnerable point of her life, and they exploited that vulnerability in the wrong place at the wrong time. But you know, it's looking at things like, you know, things like sextortion that's out there at the moment. You know, where people are not having their material hacked, but are doing things and sharing it with individuals that they don't know, which then can cause lots and lots of pressure. Don't always trust that the avatar that you're speaking to is the person that they say that they are within that online space. But equally, it's not the end of the world either. Make sure that you speak to somebody before it gets or goes too far.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Leigh? Did you want to just add any last minute bits?
Just in relation to the use of the international tools, I know I talk about it a lot, but it was my bread and butter. I think when you're investigating anything, please just use that professional curiosity to look at widening the information where you're getting it from. But also, I think we need to be aware of the inquiries that are coming into the UK, sometimes from other countries where they're looking, they've maybe potentially reported somebody as missing. I think we need to really be aware of that as well, that sometimes that is used in relation to honour-based violence, where we've had incidents where people have been reported missing in the UK by relatives overseas when they've actually come here for sanctuary. So we still just need to be aware of what we're dealing with and how far reaching some of these inquiries can be. And we've got the tools to use them, to find that information out, so please use them.
Okay, so we've heard from the panel and we've had quite a few questions from the online participants as well as in the room. One of the things that struck out to me is the fact that we all talk about collaboration, and that's the holistic approach. That's the charities, the NGOs, the policing, the health, the education, all working together to create those safe environments so that people can ask for help, and that the prosecution may not necessarily be the right solution for everyone. Sometimes it is just about the place of safety and making sure that those people are taken away from that dangerous situation. But one of the messages for me, the clear message, is that if a person needs help, they need the trust and confidence in policing to be able to pick up the phone and ask for help. And if they haven't got that, that there are other organisations that they can go to. So I just want to say, on behalf of the London Policing College, thank you all for logging on, thank you all for listening, and the amazing questions that we've got. Some of them are going to have to be responded to with our written material after this event, but we are very grateful that you listened, and I'm absolutely amazed at the wonderful panel and the contributions that you've made. So thank you all very much for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much.